Good afternoon. We're here with J.J. Green, National Security Correspondent for WTOP, WTOP.com. J.J., we want to talk about this episode, your latest episode of the Target USA podcast. I understand you had an interesting interview with General Mike Flynn a couple years ago that right now is revealing a few clues about what was yet to come, and we know now that he's under investigation by the Pentagon for his work with the Russians. Can you tell us a little bit about that interview?
Well, just a little bit about the background about where this all came from. In 2014, he was fired. He resigned, but he was pressured to resign by the Obama administration from his position as head of DIA. He's a four-star general, a lieutenant general, who was very respected by everyone, and it turns out that he wasn't. It turns out that people had a problem with his leadership style and some other things. So he resigned, and he kind of disappeared. I managed to catch up with him in 2015 and invited him for an interview. During the course of this time, there was the situation that took place in Paris, the Bataclan, the Paris attacks. There was the situation that happened in San Bernardino with the ISIS attack there. There was also the rise of ISIS was happening at that point. So many things were going on. So I shoved this aside and never did anything with it. And later, a year later, he pops up at the Republican National Convention, July of 2016, with this whole lock her up, crooked Hillary, hashtag never Hillary campaign role that he was playing. And then we started hearing, as the campaign ended, the election ended, about concerns that he had had some interaction with the Russian government and with Vladimir Putin, etc. So it turns out, going back, we saw that he did go to Russia in 2015 after the interview that we did a speech for RT that he was paid more than $30,000 for, and had some significant interaction with the Russian government. So I started to think, as we learned about these investigations and other trouble that he was in, I remembered that he spoke significantly about Russia, about Vladimir Putin, about his visit there the year before. And I thought this might be good to help people connect some dots, because I don't think people really knew who Mike Flynn was before the Republican National Convention. People who follow national security and the Pentagon knew, but the general population did not. So I thought that this interview could help set the stage for who he really is.
So what did he say about Russia when you interviewed him in 2015?
It was nothing surprising at the time. It's nothing surprising now by itself. But when you look at the fact that one thing he said was, yeah, I went there the last year of my tenure at DIA, and I met with my counterpart. But he said, we didn't talk about Russia-U.S. matters. We just talked about general stuff, and we talked about the rise of radical Islam. And if you think back to the early days of the Trump administration, specifically right after the election, before the administration began, Mr. Trump talked a lot about radical Islam. So you see that there was some connection between what Mr. Flynn, General Flynn, was thinking, and his counterparts in Russia were thinking, and what later the Trump team were thinking.
Yeah.
As you know, he became the national security advisor for a while before being fired for essentially not telling them about his relationship with Russia. He talked about that sort of casual meeting the year before. He didn't talk about anything else. But later that year, in 2015, he went to Russia, and he talked specifically with them about radical Islam in this RT interview.
Yeah.
He also, in this 2015 interview with us before he went to Russia the second time, he talked about how the U.S. needed to understand Vladimir Putin. He talked about how the U.S. needed to figure out a way to dialogue with him. And he was pretty harsh in his references to what Russia had done in Georgia, South Ossetia, and Ukraine back during the interview that we did, and which you will hear on the podcast.
Yeah.
But I have to wonder, did he engage that way with the Russians when he went back, and certainly when he was seen in that photograph sitting next to Vladimir Putin at the dinner, did he talk to him about those concerns
Right.
that he had? Looking back at the interview, it seemed as though to me he felt as though if he had given the opportunity, someone should and could engage with the Russians, and that may be a part of what set the stage for him going there. And whether or not he did engage the same way with them, it's just not clear.
Now, just to clarify, do you believe or do we know if he had interaction with the Russians before your interview with him? Could he have already been setting a stage, or?
Well, again, it could be. We just don't have any proof and don't want to suggest anything or speculate about that. But keep in mind, he left DIA in 2014. And I want to say it was around the spring of 2014. It may have been later. We caught up with him a year later.
Yeah. Okay.
And this was in April of 2015. He ended up going to Russia 8 months later in
Okay.
2015. So someone somewhere along the way between April and December made contact with
Right.
him, and he was comfortable enough to go there, and certainly comfortable enough to take $35,000 from them. So some kind of connection was made. But one thing I really want to point out to you, Kelly, he is under investigation by the FBI, and a part of why, maybe not him per se, but Russian activity in the U.S., and a part of what sparked this investigation were wiretapped calls of him engaging with Sergei Kislyak, who was the Russian ambassador to the U.S. He was incidental in the collection, Flynn was. So he wasn't the target. Kislyak was. But the fact that he engaged with Kislyak was of great concern to many people in the U.S. intelligence and national security structure, because some felt as though he was talking to the Russians about matters that should have been matters of national security, and they should not be privy to.
Right. And, just to be clear, it's not illegal for Americans to lobby on behalf of foreign governments. It happens all the time. But in his case, the Pentagon says now, and I believe this week opened an investigation on him, that he had to get permission as a former officer.
Right. Yeah, and to be clear,
he did not, apparently, or that's what they're investigating.
That's, I think, what they're investigating. But to be clear about it, everybody that does business with a foreign government that is a citizen here has to register.
Has to register
with
FARA.
FARA, exactly. And the exact full name escapes me at the moment, but it is a U.S. DOJ, a Justice
Right.
Department office that you have to register for. The other part of this situation that's important as far as Flynn goes is that retired generals are simply not allowed to take money from foreign governments. And this is the understanding that I have after listening to Congressman Jason Chaffetz and Elijah Cummings, who are the chair and vice chair of the House Oversight Committee, and they're very concerned about this. That's my understanding. So what he did, according to his attorney, Robert Kellner, who sent me a statement, and we talk about this in the podcast as well, he did everything that he was supposed to, gave the government and the Pentagon everything that he was supposed to give them. But still, that's not enough for some folks in the government who think that there's a problem with this. And the Pentagon Inspector General started an investigation in early April 4th. We just learned about it 2 days ago because Cummings and Chaffetz essentially told the press about it. And this is another level of concern about what it is that's going on with him.
Yeah, and I listened to the podcast. It's fascinating to hear this interview, now 2 years on, after everything that's happened in terms of his demise with the administration and these ongoing investigations. But what I found was that he seemed very nuanced and even maybe a little bit sympathetic with the Russian position. Not sympathetic in that he agreed with it, but he, like you said, felt that we should understand how Putin is thinking. So, without trying to solve this mystery ourselves, I would say that he might have been open to it sounded like he was open to talking with the Russians and
Yeah.
keeping communication, might be open to,
Engaging.
engaging.
I mean, let's be clear about this. There was no love lost between Vladimir Putin and President Obama.
Right.
The Russian government and the Obama administration did not have that kind of relationship. What Flynn was saying, and rightfully so, you have to engage with everyone, friends, enemies, frenemies, whoever.
Right.
You have to engage, and he felt as though the Obama administration had not done any of that. And I think another element of what he was talking about, because if I'm correct about this, memory serves me correct, he may have a degree in history, Flynn, and I remember meeting him in 2013 for a really bizarre scenario that we talk about in the podcast as well. Maybe we can chat about that for a minute after this. But he talked about the fact that Vladimir Putin was trying to make a statement in Russian history. He was trying to not be the guy in Russian history
Right.
that let any more of Mother Russia
Yeah.
or what used to be the Soviet Empire get away.
Exactly.
And that's what was taking place with Ukraine at the time of the invasion. They were about to join, I think, the EU, well, certainly they were trying to join the West.
Yep.
And that's right there on Russia's
Right. That's a
doorstep.
flashpoint.
Right.
Right. So coming from any other, say, Russian scholar or foreign policy expert in this field, what he was saying was not, it wasn't oddball and by any measure. But knowing what we know now,
Right.
that he actually worked with the Russians.
This is the thing, yeah.
So it puts another spin on it.
This is the thing, Kelly, that so many people have been scratching their heads about since this all blew up. Having met Mike Flynn and having engaged with him subsequently several times after he was fired, I mean, it always just seemed like Mike Flynn was just a really dialed in but aggressive military guy. I mean, clearly you don't get to be a 4-star without doing some things right.
Yeah.
But how could he do this thing wrong? This thing.
Yeah.
And so we don't have any answers to it. And I don't try in the podcast, or now, I'm not going to try to do that now or at any point in this situation, to tell people what Mike Flynn was thinking or
Right.
what was going on or why he did what he did, or to judge him in any way, except to say that Mike Flynn did some things that people don't understand. And I thought that this podcast would be a good way to shed some light on it by helping people to connect the dots. That's a part of the